This leads us to Aristotle. Aristotle, as I mentioned in class, is an ancient Greek philosopher in the classical period, so around 300 BCE. So he obviously was not thinking about experience machines. Robert Nozick's piece about the experience machine was in the 1970s. But Aristotle, I think if he were alive today, he would like that thought experiment. And he would have exactly the intuitions that many of you did. He would say, I definitely don't want to plug in, and I can give, my theory of the good life explains why neither I nor you nor almost anyone else, or at least very few people, would actually want to plug in here. Hedonism can't explain it, because if hedonism's true, then we should want to plug in. But Aristotle says, I've got a theory of the good life that explains why. So here's some relevant passages. This is from the Nicomachean Ethics from the assigned reading. Since there are many ends and we choose some of them, give some weird examples, because of something else, it is clear that not all ends are complete. But the best good is apparently something complete. And so, if only one end is complete, the good we are looking for will be this end. If more ends than one are complete, it will be the most complete of these. Then he goes on to say, we say that an end pursued in its own right is more complete than an end pursued because of something else, and that an end that is never choice-worthy because of something else is more complete than ends that are choice-worthy both in their own right and because of something else. Hence, an end that is always choice-worthy in its own right, never because of something else, is complete without qualification. And by completeness, very roughly, he means something like good. He's giving us a kind of ranking here. There are, among things we aim for, the very best thing we aim for, if it's out there, is something that we only ever want for its own sake, and for the sake of which we want everything else that we want. And then there are, Aristotle is claiming here, there are also some ends that we want for their own sake, but that we also get something else from them. So it's both choice-worthy, even if nothing else resulted, but something does result from it that we want as well. And that's sort of the second place good for him. And then the least valuable or least complete goods are those that we only ever choose for the sake of something else. So we have this ranking. Ends that are choice-worthy only for the sake of other ends. This numerically, I've got these in the reverse order. So this is increasing in value. Ends that are choice-worthy only for the sake of other ends are the least valuable. Ends that are both choice-worthy for the sake of other ends and for their own sake, sort of the middle case. And then the best good, if it's out there, is an end that's choice-worthy only for its own sake. You can think of this as like very roughly corresponding to, I thought I had a slide here, but I don't, corresponding to the distinction that we've seen between intrinsic and extrinsic goods, right? So ends that are choice-worthy only for their own sake, if such ends exist, the best one is an intrinsic good that is not also an extrinsic good. And an end that is choice-worthy only for the sake of something else is something that's its goodness is entirely extrinsic, like money. And then Aristotle has this interesting category of things that he thinks are both choice-worthy for their own sake and choice-worthy for the sake of something else. And those are goods that are both intrinsically valuable, but they have additional value added on in virtue of their relationship to other goods. So what are things in this category? This is an important passage. He says, happiness more than anything else seems complete without qualification. So that's that final category of ends that we only want for their own sake. Happiness seems to be the best candidate for this, he says. For we always choose it because of itself and never something else. Why do you want to be happy? That's not a very sensible question. But for anything else I want, if you ask me why questions enough, eventually I'm going to say, I don't know, because I think it's going to make me happy. I think it's going to make my life go well. And then if you try to follow up and say, but why do you want your life to go well? It's going to be hard to know how to answer that question. And then he says this, honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue We certainly choose because of themselves, since we would choose each of them, even if it had no further result. But we also choose them for the sake of happiness, supposing that through them we shall be happy. So this is a distinguishing feature of Aristotle's view. And you can think of it as giving, what Aristotle's doing here is giving a rival theory of value to the hedonist. So whereas the hedonist wanted to say that there's only one intrinsic good, that's pleasure, and everything else that has value or goodness, its goodness is entirely derivative or extrinsic in virtue of its ability to get us pleasure. And Aristotle thinks there are a variety of intrinsic goods. Knowledge or understanding, he says, is intrinsically good, desirable for its own sake. Virtue, which is going to become the centerpiece of his account of happiness, desirable for its own sake. Why do I want to be generous? Why do I want to be courageous? Both because that is going to help me flourish, as we'll see in a second, but also just because it's the right thing, just as a good thing to do. And pleasure, he thinks, is also intrinsically good. So he agrees with the hedonist that pleasure is intrinsically good, but he denies that it's the only intrinsic good. Something like money and material goods, those are extrinsic goods, and they're only extrinsically good. So here on this chart I have, over on the left-hand side, things that are only extrinsically good. And if they didn't get us something, we would never want them. And then in the middle, there's this unique category of a plurality of things that are desirable for their own sake, and they're extrinsically good. They're good also because they get us happiness, or eudaimonia. So the arrows represent good because of. So money is good because it gets us these things in the middle category. The things in the middle category are good ultimately because, according to Aristotle, they're constituent parts of the good life, or eudaimonia, or happiness. The only thing that is intrinsically good and not extrinsically good is happiness. So these little circular arrows represent good in and of itself. So this means that knowledge, virtue, and pleasure for Aristotle are both good in and of themselves, and good because they get us eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, on the other hand, is good in and of itself, but has no further consequence that it gets its value from. All of its value is right there in it. You want happiness just for its own sake. So this is the contrasting picture with the hedonist theory of value, where for the hedonist, all the way over at the right-hand side is pleasure. And the hedonist doesn't really have room for a category of goods that are both intrinsically good and extrinsically good. They say there's just one intrinsic good, and that's pleasure. Knowledge, virtue, and these other things, entirely extrinsic. That's another point where Aristotle disagrees with the hedonist. So that's a sort of background, the disagreement between the hedonist and Aristotle about their theories of value or goodness. And this now puts us in a position to spell out Aristotle's theory of the good life, or his theory of welfare. So while the hedonist said that well-being for a human is the life of maximal net pleasure, Aristotle says the well-lived or flourishing or eudaimonic human life is the life of moral virtue. So these are some figures you might think had those kinds of lives. So how does he arrive at this conclusion? Why does he think that the good life for a human is the life of moral virtue? Why does he think that eudaimonia, or happiness, is achieved primarily through virtue? Why not pleasure, right? That pleasure is intrinsically good, according to him. Why not honor? Why not knowledge? Why not just the life of contemplation? And while he does take those views seriously, he ultimately thinks that virtue is the best way to get eudaimonia. How does he arrive at this conclusion? This is the function argument. So here's a really key passage. Presumably the remark that the best good is happiness is apparently something generally agreed. Like, no one's going to dispute that we're all after happiness at the end of the day. Even the hedonist agrees with that. We still need a clearer statement of what the best good is. The important question philosophically is, what is happiness? What does the good life look like? And Aristotle, instead of saying, well, let's just pick one of those things that seem to be good, like pleasure, and say that's really it, let's instead think more carefully about what we are as human beings. Perhaps then, he says, we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, that is, doing well, or living the good life, for a flautist, a sculptor, and every craftsman, and in general for whatever has a function and a characteristic action, seems to depend on its function, the same seems to be true for a human being, if indeed a human has some function. And then he goes on to argue what is the function of a human being, if there is one. It's not just being alive, right? It's not sense perception, because we don't have those in common. We do have those in common with one another, but other things that are non-human have those in common with us too. So the function of a human needs to be something unique that marks us out as human. And what he comes to is this conclusion: the remaining possibility then is some sort of life of action, the part of the soul that has reason. We have found then that the human function is activity of the soul in accord with reason, or requiring reason. I'm not going to read this, but this is filling out a little more detail. He goes on to say that it's not just any old use of reason, right? You can use reason badly. It's the virtuous use of reason, the excellent use of reason throughout a life that makes one fulfill the function of a human. So here's the function argument. We've sort of already hit on the premises by just reading through those passages. The first premise is the characteristic function of a human being is the life of action of the part of the soul that has reason. This is locating specifically what the human function is. The second claim is a thesis about the relationship between what the good life is, or the good for a human, and whatever the characteristic function of a human is. Second premise, FA2, says the good life for a human being is a life that, whatever life this is, that fulfills the characteristic function of the characteristic human function. And then the first premise has come in and given us a specification of what that function is. Therefore, the good life for a human is the life of action of the part of the soul that has reason. Now, that little phrase there he repeats in this part of the Nicomachean Ethics, it's not super clear what he means, but it becomes clear later on in the Ethics that he's talking about moral virtue when he says action of the part of the soul that has reason. He's talking about the moderation of one's desires and emotions through acts of reason. That is what marks us out as humans. Our ability to stand back from our desires and our emotions, think through them carefully using our reason, and make decisions about what to do. That distinguishes us from both non-human animals and from the gods, who don't have desires and don't have emotions. So the first premise, we've already sort of seen the defense of the first premise, process of elimination argument, so I'm not going to go through it again, but there it is if you want to pause here and look at it. Likewise, the second argument, the second premise here just says the good life for a human is whatever life fulfills the characteristic human function. And the defense of this premise just rests on a principle that he hopes you'll find intuitive, the kind relativity principle, which says that the good life, existence, or way of being for a thing of kind K, where K is just a variable for any kind whatsoever, alive, not alive, man-made, natural, any kind. To live well, or to be good, to be a good instance of that kind, is just determined by whatever the characteristic function of a K is. So here's your chair, right? This is a good chair. Why is it a good chair? Because it supports human weight. maybe it's got particularly comfortable back. We could add some of those details. Why is it that those features make this a good instance of the kind chair? Well, because the function of a chair is to hold up human weight. So a chair that can do that well is a good chair. And of course, a chair that can't do that, that has a broken leg, where when you sit on it you fall off and die, that's a bad chair. Why? Well, because the function of a chair is to hold up human weight, and a chair that can't do that in virtue of having a broken leg is a bad one. Now, is a human with a broken leg thereby a bad human? Well, no, not according to Aristotle, not necessarily, because the function of a human is not really to walk. I mean, that's important for us, but it's important for us to walk only insofar as that is a causally required condition for becoming virtuous, which it's not, right? Like disabled people, people who have physical disabilities can be just as virtuous as people who are able-bodied. So at the end of the day, it is reason operating on emotion, which is a psychological characteristic, not a physical one, that makes a human a good human.